Hey, everyone. It is his fault that a political journalist is on this stage, so don't get mad at me. Get mad at the ambassador. All right. I have so much I want to talk with you about.
Let's
but
go.
The number one thing that everyone's been asking me about you is a new hat that you're wearing at the Kennedy Center.
Oh.
What? What is going on? How did that happen? How big an art connoisseur are you? Walk me through the behind the scenes there.
Well, we want to make art great again.
And what does that mean?
No, look. I think I don't know for sure, but I think the frustration that President Trump had is that the Kennedy Center has no cash on hand, no reserves, and they have been paying for the salaries with the debt reserves while taking around $40 million of public money. And so you can't have that. If you're going to take public money, then you get to have public input. And so what we're going to say at the Kennedy Center is, first of all, we got to clean up the financial situation. We have to do the big productions that the masses and the public want to see. We want to have really good programming. So the first thing that we're doing, I think the big change is for everybody to know you got to be at the Kennedy Center in December, because we are doing a big, huge celebration of the birth of Christ at Christmas. How crazy is it to think that we're going to celebrate Christ at Christmas with a big traditional production to celebrate what we are all celebrating in the world during Christmas time, which is the birth of Christ.
Do you worry at all, though? I know there have been some folks who have been dropping out of performing at the Kennedy Center in protest. Do you worry about being able to bring in big artists to the center? No,
we don't, because we already have them, and I think it's a real misnomer. But let me just say, there's one thing that got a lot of attention that this group dropped out, and it was all blamed on President Trump and me. And we've tried to correct the record, and I think we're going to have to do a more direct job, because it wasn't true. They had the Kennedy Center, before I arrived, before President Trump was the chairman, the Kennedy Center had made some decisions about this individual group to change them because ticket sales were atrocious. And so they said, you know what, we can't have this because we really don't have any money, and we can't be spending on things that aren't bringing in revenue. And so they made this change before we came, and then it was announced, and suddenly it was, you know, the gay men's chorus or something was dropping out because of Trump. That wasn't true. And it was replaced with some other things. That happens all the time. So I would just challenge you.
So you would welcome the gay men's choir to perform if they were interested?
Well, first of all, right now, if you're going to take public money, you have to prove that you actually can bring in revenue. We don't have any money. The woman that had my job before me was getting paid $1.3 million a year, and we had no money.
How much are you getting paid for this?
Way, way, way less.
Wait, let me ask real quick, though, because we were talking about this a little bit backstage. How did this happen? Because you're going to Venezuela, you're going to Munich, and then suddenly you wake up and you're running the Kennedy Center?
Well, again, I think it was a frustration from the president that there was no money at the Kennedy Center.
But why you?
Content
and how did it
crazy.
come about?
I don't know. You'd have to ask him. Look, I love the arts. I'm somebody who, goes already to lots of different art styles. I appreciate a whole bunch of different styles of art. If I started naming all these things, you would be like, wait a minute.
You're a connoisseur. We believe it. So listen, I want to talk about some of the major conflicts that we're seeing around the world right now that I know you've been working on. Number one, I mean, I think this has been top of the list for everyone at the White House, is the situation in Ukraine. In your conversations with President Trump, what do you hear from him about what's going on with his relationship with Zelensky, President Zelensky? Because it's clear that they've never necessarily been best friends, but it feels like in the last few days in particular, that relationship has soured. What's going on?
Look, I think, I'm so thankful that we have a president who's concentrating on peace. And that's what Donald Trump has just said. Let's stop. Remember that we handed Joe Biden total peace in the Middle East and total peace in Europe. He handed us a war in the Middle East and a war in Europe. And we can never forget that. So I do get a little bit frustrated with reporters when they're trying to say, oh, your decision now isn't perfect. I'm like, yeah, we were put in a hole. We were put in a terrible situation. There are no great solutions right now. So you're going to have to be patient with us that we're trying to dig the Biden people out from this terrible $100 billion hole that they created. That's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think it's fair to say that somehow President Trump has met with President Zelensky 4 or 5 times. The Trump team has met with the Ukrainians and Zelensky another 4 or 5 times. So let's say we're up to 10 times meeting with the Ukrainians. I never once heard from the media an outrage that the Russians weren't invited to those talks. However, the one time that the Trump team reaches out to say, how about we talk to the Russians, there's this hue and cry from the Europeans and everybody to say, why aren't the Ukrainians
involved? Well, I think
involved?
it's because the Russians are the aggressors in this situation, and that's another question I wanted to ask you. You know, President Trump has blamed Ukraine recently for starting the war. You know better than anyone that it was Russian aggression actually back in 2014. People forget that this goes over a decade back. But it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. So do you have a sense of why President Trump is making these claims now that Ukraine started the war?
I think what President Trump is saying very clearly is we have to stop this war. He is somebody who's concentrating on saying to both sides, let's talk to both sides and figure out how we stop this. Again, we have terrible choices because of the Biden team. There's not a lot of great choices. And so, yeah, is there frustration that things are not perfect in Ukraine right now? Yeah, but I'm a little bit annoyed that we were handed a file that was war when we handed them a file that was peace. And so I do think that we're frustrated. And it's
why
fair.
make those false claims about who started the war? Why call Zelensky a dictator? What is happening there?
Look, I think the American people are really frustrated with Zelensky. I think that there's a big frustration that he's not making great choices for peace. And again, when the American people are spending hundreds of billions of dollars, there's a frustration. Let's go back, you said 2014. Let's go back just to the beginning of this war, where Joe Biden messaged for more than 30 days that he knew through intelligence that a war was absolutely coming. The Europeans and the Biden administration all did one thing, which was prepare for more war. They talked about more funding for war. They battened down the hatches. They got hardware in there. No one was talking about peace. I actually think it's pretty immoral if the President of the United States says we're having a war in 30 days and we know for sure, and no one shows up in Moscow and Kiev to try to say, let's do diplomacy, let's stop a war. And now we're $100 billion later, and so there's a frustration.
So you said President Zelensky isn't making the choices for peace. What do you think are those choices that he should make to bring an end to this, that he's not making now?
First of all, hundreds of billions of dollars of American money, again, I'll say that, and a whole bunch is missing. So we immediately say, okay, mismanagement of funds. What we want to see is talks with Putin. I don't think that talking means that you're weak. I actually think talking is a tactic to get to a goal. And so we've seen with President Trump, he can show up with Kim Jong-un, and we need to be able to have these conversations with the Russians. Look, I've done negotiations my whole life. I did Serbia-Kosovo negotiations. And I can tell you that if you're in the middle trying to bring peace, trying to make sure we're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars on war and we're saving lives, you need at least a person in the middle who can say, I'm going to talk to these guys, and I'm going to talk to these guys, and I don't care what kind of criticism I get, I got to figure out a way for peace. It's not going to be perfect, Josh, I will give you that. But again, I go back to the fact of we had it perfect in terms of peace. We were handed a war, and now we're being criticized of, well, how do you dig us out of a war, and you're not doing it fast enough, and you're not doing it fair enough? So we're a little frustrated.
So the social media stuff, I mean, President Trump called Zelensky a dictator. Do you believe he's a dictator?
Well, I think when you reject having elections and you're not moving towards that way, that people get angry about that.
Is Putin a dictator?
Of course.
Putin is a dictator?
Yeah, of course.
So the stuff that we're seeing on social media.
But I want to say one thing that's really important in this conversation. Donald Trump has done something different than Republican foreign policy leaders have done for 25 years.
This is a paradigm shift, what he's doing.
We articulate very clearly under Donald Trump, we don't do regime change. We are going to deal with the countries that are in front of us. And our criteria is not how do we make that country better, how do we make America better, stronger, and more prosperous for the people that live here.
So I was in the East Room when President Trump held the presser with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he announced the plans for the Riviera of the Middle East in Gaza. Is that art of the deal talk? Is that a serious plan? What is your sense of where President Trump is headed with that idea?
Well, first of all, let's start from the fact that he's a great negotiator. So we know that he's negotiating all of the time. Secondly, I think, again, I sound like, I keep repeating myself, but we had peace there. We had peace agreements, right? The media and the intelligence agencies told President Trump if you moved the embassy, there would be outright war. We know the opposite happened. Peace agreements broke out. And so I think you got to say to Donald Trump, you know how to deliver peace. You certainly know how to negotiate Americans into a peaceful situation. And so my kind of attitude is let's watch and see how this plays out, because I have full faith that Donald Trump is a great negotiator, and he's delivered peace before, and he's going to have to do it again now because of the Biden regime.
Regardless of what it looks like, us getting involved in Gaza, I mean, President Trump has talked about getting out of foreign entanglements. That's a promise that he made on the campaign trail. How does that jive with his promise?
I think that's an incredibly fair question.
Thank you. You hear that, guys?
No, I do. I think it's a legitimate question to say, wait a minute, you've said this.
Yeah.
Again, what I think the thinking and the criteria is how do we deliver peace? And I've spent 8 years at the UN, and what's been happening in the Palestinian territories and in Gaza, we've been talking about for decades. We were talking about this.
The U.S. still has a role to play and should play a role in peace in the Middle East, even with the America First agenda?
Yes, but that doesn't immediately mean that we jump to boots on the ground. And I would say the other thing is, I'm a diplomat. You're going to hear me talk about diplomacy, not about war and the things of war. But I will say that as kind of a chastisement to the public debate right now, when you talk about security assurances, stop assuming that security assurances are just simply American boots or UN boots and guns. I can't think of a better security assurance than private equity folks on the ground. American businessmen on the ground trying to do deals and help rebuild or help bring economic development. If you've got a bunch of Americans or Westerners even that are in Ukraine, that are in the Black Sea, doing economic development, I can't think of a better way to have a security assurance.
And I know we're running low on time here. I do want to talk to you about the wildfires in Los Angeles. I know you know people who have lost homes. I think anyone that knows anyone in LA knows people who have had tremendous loss there. How are the recovery efforts going? I know the president at the roundtable in the Palisades tasked you with some of that effort. How are things going with FEMA? We know Democrats and Republicans can agree that FEMA doesn't always work effectively and quickly. What are the bottlenecks, and what are you doing there?
Well, thanks for asking. I think that the reality is that the federal response is mostly money, and so we are going to have strings on the money that we give to California. They've made terrible...
There will be conditions. Okay.
There will be conditions. We're talking about those conditions now. As a Californian, I'm all for it, because I don't have faith that if we went back and we just gave California hundreds of millions of dollars, they were going to go back to their same old ways of not giving enough water, having dangerous situations on the ground when it comes to forestry. It's going to happen again.
What are some of those strings you're talking about?
Well, I don't want to commit too much, but...
Give us a little.
But I will say this. Everyone who's involved knows that the California Coastal Commission is a disaster, and it needs to absolutely be defunded. And from just a way to think about government, we already have local government making these decisions. Layering it on with the California Coastal Commission is a terrible idea. It's an unelected group of people who are crazy, woke left, and one person can stop progress, and they've made California less safe. I think squeezing their federal funds, making sure they don't get funds, putting strings on them to get rid of the California Coastal Commission is going to make California better.
While we're on California, since you have so many ideas for the state, are we going to see Ric Grenell run for governor of California?
Honestly, it's not in my plan unless Kamala Harris runs for governor. If Kamala runs,
you're jumping in?
I mean, here's the thing. We already know who she is. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to define who Kamala Harris is. If she thinks that she's going to run for governor of California, a Republican is going to win, and I may not be able to resist trying to run against her.
Making news here at CPAC. Lastly, before I let you go, we talked about the Kennedy Center. You've got that performance coming up in December, but what is your ideal performance at the Kennedy Center if you could have anyone perform?
Dolly Parton.
Dolly Parton. Is that an official invitation?
Of course, of course. I'd love to see it.
All right, Mr. Grenell, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.